as most of you will recall, last year we passed a bill that allowed this new TIFI program, and we've had a lot of questions around, since we passed the bill, we've had a lot of questions around what actually they are and what they do and how they work. And so I've asked them to come in today and kind of give us an overview of the program, and they've already had some pretty good successes, so we're going to hear some of that too. So which one of you guys would like to go first? They were unsure who was going to go first.
Right. CEO and Chairman of the Board.
Okay.
Push the button.
There we go. Now you can hear me. Okay. I'm Brad Hepner. I'm the CEO and Chairman of Beneficient. It is the state's first technology-enabled fiduciary financial institution under the new Act 2074. So we have three of us that are going to present today. I'll provide you an overview of Beneficient and what companies like ours do in the industry across the United States. Alan Dinas runs our trust company here in Kansas as the head of it, and he will provide an overview of what these companies do and how they relate to the Office of the State Bank Commissioner as a trust company. Derek Fletcher is our President Fiduciary Officer, and he will share with you the relationship with the Department of Commerce, the funding flows and the capital that the state's rural communities will benefit from. And then I'll step back up and share with you what's happened since you passed the law. And we want to thank everyone who has been involved in passing the law. I want to thank Chairman Tarwater for giving us this opportunity to present this afternoon. There is a presentation that was made available to everyone, and I'm unsure if they're going to show it on the screens or not. Does anyone know?
We can certainly do that. Is there someone that can pull that up? Dennis, would you be able to pull that up if we can get it to you?
It's one that was circulated to the committee, I think yesterday afternoon. And we can forward it to you right now as well, if you would rather us just do that.
Yeah, if you could forward that to me, that would be fantastic. I can pull it up.
Here, why don't you type in?
Stand by, please.
I'll go ahead, while we wait for that to come up, I'll go ahead and provide an overview of what Beneficient does. Beneficient provides custodial services and trustee management services, and most importantly, liquidity and financing to investors in alternative assets. Part of the presentation, we'll talk about what alternative assets are comprised of. The easy way at the outset of the presentation is that an alternative asset is an institutional type asset that is professionally managed for large pension plans, endowments, and foundations. As an example, CAPERS, the Public Employee Retirement System here in the state, allocates about 20% of the total asset base to these types of assets. And so these have been long-time institutionally managed assets. I began in the industry in 1986, back when the global amount of institutional investments in the space was $30 billion. Today, the global amount is about $9.1 trillion. So it's grown up to be a very large industry, one of the largest asset classes for large institutional investors. A few years back, big private banks on Wall Street like Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Union Bank of Switzerland began to offer these types of investment options to wealthy individuals in the United States. They had to meet a qualified purchaser standard by SEC standards, and that means they had to be worth over $5 million of investable assets. That couldn't include their home or their business, truly investable assets. And these big Wall Street banks began advising their customers, their clients, into making investments in this space. But instead of making investments like institutions do in individual investment amounts of $5, $10, $20, $50 million, the banks offered individuals the opportunity to invest at $250,000, $350,000, but in the same asset. So they'd create a fund. Investors would begin investing in this, and they'd invest alongside the big institutions like Capers. I grew up in the business in the side of the asset management, making those investments for those investors that were the institutions and not the individuals. My institutions included many of the state's big pension plans of my company. It included a lot of endowments and foundations across the United States, and I sold that to a Wall Street bank so that they could take my advisory business and begin offering it to individuals through their distribution networks. As individuals invested in it, it became harder and harder for them. So about 6 years ago, the amount of individuals in the United States, we have about 1.7 million households out of about 110 million households that are worth over $5 million. And you'll find it, as members of the Commerce Committee, interesting to realize that over 70% of those people were flat broken up to their eyeballs in debt when they got out of college. They made the money themselves. And so we are a country of entrepreneurs who make the money themselves. About 10% inherited it. If you go to Europe, the numbers are flip-flop. Most of the people inherit it as opposed to being entrepreneurs and making it themselves. Out of these households that met the qualified purchaser standard, you've had nearly 1.3 million of them now invest in these types of assets, but they are left stranded without the type of fiduciary services that they need to manage those assets. Big institutions like Capers have full investment departments with professional staff that have qualifications to manage it. Capers can hire large law firms, qualified accounting firms, other fiduciaries that are consultants and advisors to advise them on these portfolios. But individuals just have a banker, and the banker typically does not assume the fiduciary responsibility for the decisions, the custody, or the management of those assets. So we began many years ago in the business offering this type of service to individuals, and we worked with the Federal Reserve and then moved to, at the advice of the Federal Reserve, to the Texas Department of Banking and began to work a framework out for how you operate and provide fiduciary services for individuals. Individuals cannot afford to hire lawyers and accountants and financial advisors. They need to look to a regulated entity that can serve in that fiduciary capacity in their best interest to do these types of services. And what those are include custodying the asset, keeping track of it, reporting on it, doing the accounting on it, sending them a monthly statement, supervising the asset as a trustee. These assets have decisions that need to be made from time to time, where you are having to participate in a vote alongside the big institutional investors, where you are having to give feedback to the manager of the underlying assets. And then finally, the investors need at times the ability to get their capital out of the investment. These investments, when a wealthy person invests in them, you sign a contract that is a minimum of 10 years where you can't get your capital out. It's not like buying a stock or a bond. This is a locked-in agreement in the traditional form of a limited partnership agreement. Now, what's happened in the industry is that the assets have lasted longer than 10 years that these alternative assets invest into. They last 12, 14, 15 years long. Okay, great. We're going to pull it up. And we'll go to, you'll control it? Let's flip to the first slide.
Yep, so we're on focus right now.
And you want to just, right here, we'll start here. So what Beneficient does is we serve the high net worth individual. It's the first on the left here. We serve the managers of the underlying alternative asset investor. We serve the wealth managers and the financial advisors who are not fiduciaries. These are those private banks that sell the assets to the individual investors. And we serve the small institutions, small hospital funds, small college endowments, and so forth across the nation that have made these types of investments. We provide them the custodial trustee management, and then we finance the assets. And that's what I was sharing just when the slides come up. What that means is individuals need out of the asset many times well before the asset matures. It's like you need your crop out before the crop's ready to harvest. And so an institution like ourselves provides the individual with liquidity before, or a loan, before the asset has actually matured in time. And that's where we provide the liquidity. But we do it in a fiduciary capacity. That's different than what most lenders will do. In the fiduciary capacity, you're providing the investor the liquidity, looking out for their best interest. In other words, you have to look out and make sure that you are not taking advantage in any fashion of that investor, because the investor cannot afford to get their own out. They can't spend the legal bills that's required and the accounting bills to get third-party fiduciaries to do it for them. So that's a very important capacity that these investors look for us to provide. We'll move to the next slide. Beneficient's Board of Directors is made up here in Kansas, for the Kansas entity, is made up of 8 members of the board. I'm a chairman of the board, and CEO is also the founder of the company, and I grew up in Heston, Kansas. I am a 6th-generation Kansan here from Harvey County. I live in Dallas and operate the company from Dallas. Alan Dinas here operates the company now in Heston, Kansas for us. We have on our board 2 former Federal Reserve Bank chiefs, one who ran the Dallas Fed, Richard Fisher, and came onto my board after completing that tour, and then the other who ran the Atlanta Fed, Dennis Lockhart. We also have on our board one of the pioneers and founders of the industry, which is Tom Hicks. He founded one of the largest alternative asset management firms. In fact, globally, it was the largest alternative asset management firm in the 1980s. It operated out of Dallas. Many of you may or may not know him as owner of a lot of our sports teams in Texas. We also have on our board an alternative asset manager who managed insurance company assets into alternative assets, and that is Bruce Schnitzer. And then Emily Bowersox Hill is our Kansas resident director. She is chairman of the Capers Investment Committee and resides in Lawrence, Kansas. She's a longtime executive for Morgan Stanley and now has her own capital management firm. If we can flip to the next slide. We've, since the passage of the legislation, we've built up a team of professionals in Heston, Kansas with an office there as required under the statute. This new law requires at least 3 employees be resident in the state. We have 7 right now, and we are growing. Alan, Keith Martins is here with us. Jordan Bartell, which Representative Anderson may know from Newton. His family was in the banking business there, Midland National Bank in Newton. And then Phil Regier from Heston, Greg Woodard, who is from Hutchinson, Jeff Thiessen and Cameron Regier make up our office there in Heston, all joined us since the passage of the law. The next slide, and then we can move on. I'll give the overview now. The next slide. Yeah. So when we worked on creating the law, the core focus was to create a financial institution under the laws of the trust company laws here in the state of Kansas that addressed and created a regulatory framework for delivering these types of services in a regulated format under the Office of State Banking Commission. Instead of trying to explain it in the context of a traditional trust company or Kansas bank, we created a new lane of this type of business. On the left, you'll see what the Kansas Technology-Enabled Fiduciary Financial Institution will do. It does a high volume of transactions. These transactions are completed through a portal online. We many times do not know our customers that we are serving because we are actually serving them as a sub-advisor or sub-custodian, sub-manager for their private bank, typically a Wall Street private bank. And we have a national reach, coast to coast. One of the objectives of the legislation was to look to bring customers that are not residents of Kansas or customers of existing trust companies and trust banks in Kansas, bring them from out of state and bring their out of state assets here so that we can create a financial inflow, revenues off of those that then the state benefits from. So in other words, the statute is designed to bring out-of-state money here, out-of-state revenues here to benefit our rural communities. Banks in Kansas, the lane that we have traditionally had since the banking industry began here in the 1880s, and that banking law was updated and reformed in the 1940s, banks here are local and are resident, and they deal in a high touch with their customers that are residents of the state, and they deal with state assets. So there are larger transactions and so forth. So we're really looking at a comparison of a whole new industry in the trust company space that we bring into the state of Kansas. Move to the next slide. This is a slide that's in your materials that explains specifically how the business works. We utilize a technology platform. We call ours Alt Access. And through that online platform, and that's why the law is called technology enabled, we are actually operating mostly online with our networks and customers. We originate assets from residents of wealth centers across the United States. And under the law, they contribute their out-of-state assets into Kansas trusts. There are basically 7 areas in the United States where 80% of the wealth resides. That's the Bay Area of California, the Los Angeles area, specifically Newport Beach. It's the east coast of Florida, from Miami up to Palm Beach. It is Chicago. It's the Texas Triangle, which is Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. And of course, it is New York and Boston. Those are the 7 main regions where 80% of the United States wealth lives. That's where our customers come from the most part. And they have their assets also invested principally on the East Coast and West Coast in these forms of alternative assets. We provide the trustee and custodial services to them in a fiduciary capacity. In a fiduciary capacity, that's different than providing them services as an appointed and directed custodian. When you're a fiduciary, you have an obligation and duty to look out for the best interest in every decision and in every activity that you take for that specific customer. Our customers require that. They don't want to have to go hire a staff, hire lawyers, and hire accountants to oversee these assets. These assets demand that there be a fiduciary oversight on them. In that capacity, we also provide them the liquidity. They made the invest. Typically, when you're worth over $5 million, you make that money when you're in your 50s or older. And when you've made that money, your private banker comes knocking on your door, takes you to the Topeka Country Club, and begins to explain that you can invest right alongside a Harvard Endowment Fund and the state of New York in these alternative asset investments. And before you know it, you made a $250,000 commitment for an investment that's 10 to 15 years long. But as you age, life events to individuals are very different than the events that institutions have. Institutions live in perpetuity. Individuals have various life events that occur. And the experience in the industry is that within the first 5 years or so, people need to actually get their money or liquidity out of the investment before it's ready to be harvested. And that's where we step in to provide them the capital flows in order to withdraw from their investment in that alternative asset. If we can move on to the next slide. So this is a graphic that explains the real intent behind the legislation. The dark blue circles are the wealth centers. The objective of the legislation was to create the regulatory and banking framework for a firm like ourselves to operate within so that people from those 7 regions would establish Kansas trusts to move their assets here, and we would manage those assets then and provide the fiduciary services from the state of Kansas. Fees would be collected off of providing those levels of services, and those fees would be dedicated to go directly to the 71 ROS counties, to communities that have a population of 5,000 or less in the 71 ROS counties, and also to the Department of Commerce. The trust company would select which of the ROS counties and small communities they want to support, much like banks pick the community areas in which they want to provide their lending and collect their deposits. That is the model that our institutions would do as well. But a share of those fees then would go to a specific state fund under the direction of the Department of Commerce to be spread equally among all, or not equally, but as they determine, as this committee determines, across those counties, and also to use that money to promote to the industry to establish companies like ourselves here in the state of Kansas. On that point, in the state of Texas, our governor has a budget and actually used to have a condominium in the state of California to go and recruit companies. Our governor spent a lot of time there in the state of California to recruit companies to relocate and move to the state of Texas to build both our technology corridor and our energy corridors and real estate corridors in the state of Texas. Very successful. So in this context, that is a lot of the concept behind also the fund for the Department of Commerce, to have money to provide to state staff to go spend time in New York and in LA and Chicago, where most companies like us are located, and recruit those companies to establish a subsidiary here in the state of Kansas that does the same type of business that we do. It's a very large industry, and we welcome our industry moving into the state. That then generates more assets from out-of-state investors here in our state, which creates additional fees to go to our rural communities. If we move to the next slide. These are the types of alternative assets. This is the main question many people say. What is an alternative asset? Private equity funds are funds that are established by some of your largest financial firms on the globe. This is the biggest part of the industry now. Private equity firm is established by companies by the name of Blackstone and BlackRock and Bank of America and Merrill Lynch, JP Morgan. They take those funds and they go buy companies from privately, not off the New York Stock Exchange, but private companies in the state of Kansas. They buy utilities and so forth. They streamline those companies. They buy more, merge them together, consolidate industries, and they own those. Well, that money isn't coming from Blackstone. That money is coming from pensions, endowments, foundations, capers, etc., and our client base are funding the money in to buy those companies. Those companies are then sold. This is the reason why these investments are 10 to 15 years long. A Blackstone will take 3 years to find a company to buy. Then they'll take another 5 years to make that company more efficient and add more companies to it, to grow the market share necessary. They may take an additional 8 years to do that. And then they'll begin a process of either taking that company public on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, or selling that company to an international firm or an international company, or merging it into an existing public company, and that's the point in which the investor gets their money back. And that's also the point in which we get repaid for the liquidity that we early provided to the investors. Other forms of these types of investments include venture capital. Google, Starbucks, Hartport, these are companies we all know. I was a venture capital investor through my funds on behalf of state investors in all of those businesses. Big venture capital funds are established, they compile the money, and they back people like Bill Gates when they're working on their investments in their garage. Many of the apps that we have on our phones were entrepreneurs who went to venture capital funds in Boston and in Menlo Park of California and Sand Hill Road and so forth to raise their money. That's what a venture capital fund. Leveraged buyouts are a form of private equity. That's where the investors are buying companies, but they're borrowing a lot of money to buy them as well, and it's their equity at stake. Each one of these are a category of different types of alternative assets. These are types of categories are developed by institutional investors, are very involved in figuring out how they want to invest in the world of private investments, and they have pensions, endowments, and foundations have created these various categories. All of these assets are professionally managed. What that means is that the firm that raises the money into a fund is registered with the SEC and subject to examination for its marketing practices and so forth by the SEC. The institutional investors that are invested in these are among the largest in the nation. So there's a lot of scrutiny, a lot of law firms involved and so forth in the development of these types of alternative assets. If we move to the next slide, we'll see what, for our purposes under the Kansas law, alternative assets are not. This is a short list. They're not cryptocurrencies. They're not foreign currencies. They are not family-limited partnerships. A family-limited partnership is typically created to own a family business. Our alternative assets need to be professionally managed by and institutionally invested in. They aren't forms of gold bullion or wine collections. They're not Kansas farms. It's not artwork. So these are the types of assets that Kansas farms, for example, family-owned businesses and so forth, that the traditional line of Kansas trust and bank companies provide loans and help to manage those assets as trustees. If we go to the next slide. Market overview, I'll provide you very quickly the size and development of this marketplace. Move to the next slide. On the left, you'll see a chart that shows the growth of assets invested in these categories of alternative assets across the globe since 2003. Now, I'd started in the industry about 15 years before that, more than that, about 17 years before that, and that number at $900 billion there on the low left-hand side was at $33 billion when I started in the industry. Today, we're at $9.1 trillion. The institutional investors are the driving force behind the growth of this market that grows at about 14.5% each year. The number of companies on the New York Stock Exchange over that same period of time have decreased from 10,000 companies to just under 5,000 companies. New York Stock Exchange number of companies has halved. Private companies have increased, and it's because of the development of this industry in the United States. On the right side, you see the breakdown of who owns these assets. The big gray box on the bottom of $4.1 trillion, that's held by the capers of the United States, by the Harvard Endowment Funds, by your insurance company, your life insurer. They own an allocation to these types of assets as well. The top blue box is $3.3 trillion that's held by investors outside of the United States, big wealth funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so forth. National governments. The two in the middle are the developing marketplace, and that's the developing marketplace that TEFIs will serve. The top one at $800 billion, that's the individual market that is growing. It's nearly $1 trillion now. That is the market that is driving the need for TEFIs in the United States. They are driving the need. 1.5 million households need fiduciaries to provide this type of service. Right underneath that is $900 billion of small institutions. So that may be an endowment fund or a hospital fund of your local college or your regional hospital that needs these types of services. That's a total marketplace of $1.7 trillion of assets that need fiduciaries to serve as custodian, trustee, and they need a fiduciary who will act in that capacity to give them liquidity out of the investment. If we move to the next slide. The left-hand chart shows the growth. The blue bars copy that growth to $9.1 trillion. The yellow line is the demand for liquidity out of the assets. And so that you can see, but for the year of COVID, the demand for liquidity out of the assets tracks very closely to the growth of the assets in the marketplace. That line of liquidity is a demand from big institutions, from the big institution, not the individual investors. And that demand for liquidity each year is $100 billion now in big institutional demands for ability to get liquidity out of these assets. That's the marketplace that I've been serving up until the passage of the TEFI Act and our introduction to individual investors here at the end of last year. If we move to the next slide. The demand is driven by three principal factors. One, the United States is minting more and more 5 millionaires a year. It is the fastest growing segment of wealth in the United States that's growing quickly. 5 millionaires in the United States are growing at over 6% per year. Two, those individual investors are allocating more of their assets to alternatives each year. So it is growing on the number of investors, and the amount that each investor wants to invest is a larger amount. And then finally, the assets are becoming worth more each year because they earn more than bonds earn. So those three factors combine together to create an attractive growth rate. Today, the unmet demand, the new emerging demand of individual investors is at $40 billion. And they cannot access the institutional market that has a demand of $100 billion because there are not fiduciaries in that market to serve them. So for fiduciaries in the market, there's an unmet demand for $40 billion a year. of demand. Let's just dream for a minute, that Kansas was able to create enough of our companies or attract enough of our companies here into Kansas to do it. And we met that annual demand each year of that 40 billion, 100%. Now, we're not going to do it. But if we did, that's $10 billion a year of economic growth contributions to our 71 counties in this state. $10 billion a year that could be generated off of those fees if we got the whole market. That $100 billion of demand in the institutional side, 80% of that is served by only 16 companies in the United States. I was one of them. Our company was one of them. So if we move to the next slide, this slide also shows that in 5 years, the economists predict that $40 billion of demand will be at $66 billion of demand per year for liquidity. And meeting that demand of those out-of-state investors with those out-of-state assets allows us to collect that fee to go to our 71 Ross counties here in the state of Kansas. And this is the chart that shows the combination of the old demand of $100 billion and the new demand of $40 billion being driven by high net worth individuals in the 70 wealth centers of the United States, and the two top segments that we focus on, those individuals and the small institutions. If we move to the next slide. So the law required the establishment of a pilot program, which we began last year with Beneficient. Let's see and get this thing going was the idea. Alan Dinas, we hired to come in to lead this for us at Beneficient, offices out of Heston. We hired the team that you saw to begin the project. I'll let him explain how the interaction works with the Office of the State Banking Commissioner. Then Derek is going to get up and explain the interaction with the Department of Commerce and how these benefits, the economic benefits, will flow to the Ross counties and to the Department of Commerce overall. And then I'm going to step back up and give some pretty good news about our last month of activity and where we currently stand right now in the rollout of this new business. Alan?
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about Ben. And I want you to know, if you're geographically challenged like me, a lot of us in Heston think of Dallas as a suburb. So welcome to the state, kind of a thing. My job, at least starting out with Ben, was to interface and work with the state banking department. And what we're doing here is, with Ben, it's an entirely new kind of a business in this state, and it's very new to the state banking department. And so what we were running into is a lot of issues where they try to put on their banker glasses and look at our business, and things don't always work. And so we spent quite a lot of time working with them to get them to understand. And I will tell you that we've been working with them, and they're open to our ideas. It's a very cooperative kind of a relationship. The program, as we understand from a legislative standpoint, was that we're looking at a pilot program. This is an opportunity for Ben to get to know what it's like to be regulated by Kansas, and it's a good opportunity for Kansas to learn how to regulate these industries and really build a solid foundation for additional companies to come into the state. So with the legislation, Ben was allowed to operationalize the TEFI to get started. We work with the state banking department to talk about issues that are peculiar to Ben and get them to understand that the kinds of people they're going to have to bring on board to successfully regulate the industry and do it in a way that it's safe and sound for the industry, but it's good for the state as well. And if we'd skip to the next slide. So at this point, we are collaborating with the state. We're working on regulations, we're working on exam procedures, and it's an educational process all the way around. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide as well. We've had many meetings. I think I'm going to buy my own chair for their office. so I have a comfortable one. But we've had 98 requests for information. We've submitted over 100 documents, almost 2,500 pages of documents for them to read. Since July, we've had at least 10 meetings, numerous phone calls, and that continues even to this week, where we continue to work with the state. The OSBC sent a team down to Dallas. It would have been about the middle of November. I know there was a holiday involved, and they were very gracious in coming on down to get a feel for what the operation looked like, meet some of our key people, and give them a chance to ask very pointed questions about items that they had concern. Let's go ahead and skip to the next slide then. So we have our offices in Heston. We continue to build out and improve on them. We've made the qualified investments required by the statute. We've satisfied the statutory requirements for a charter. And then on December 30th, the state granted us that charter, and we are now in business. And so at this point, we continue to work. We know that they're required to do an exam. We're working together to develop the pieces and parts of that exam. And also to help them understand the framework in terms of how you evaluate assets and the quality of the assets. It's different than commercial banking. So with that being said, I think I'll turn it over to Derek now, and he can talk about the next step, and that's how we interface with the Department of Commerce in our enterprise growth zones. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Tarwater and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity to visit with you today. I really get the fun job, and that is to talk about what we'll be doing for rural Kansas in the communities across the state that are located within economic growth zones. And that was certainly a central part of the legislation that this body considered and passed last year. As Brad indicated, and we can move to the next slide if you don't mind. As Brad indicated, our customer base exists and lives and operates really in wealth centers across the United States, not here in Kansas. And so we attract those customers through our technology platform. One point of clarification, just in terms of understanding who we are and what we do not take deposits. Right. We are not a traditional bank from the standpoint of the traditional banking services that you would encounter in your community bank. We don't compete with Kansas banks. Instead, we believe that we will be partnering with and collaborating with and benefiting Kansas banks in terms of our trust deposits, in terms of the economic growth that we're able to really create within the rural communities that will benefit local banks and trust companies at large. So if we could move to the next slide, if you don't mind. So again, when we have customers that engage us for fiduciary services, and in particular with respect to securing liquidity out of the investments that they've made, as a part of the process, they will set up Kansas trusts. And as Brad alluded to, those customers, as a part of the process, incur a fee, which is traditional in financial services. That fee is 2.5% of the financing that we provide. That 2.5% is what is earmarked for the economic growth zones within the state of Kansas. And what we're going to talk about during the remainder of my time is how are those assets managed? Who is responsible for deploying those assets in the community? What is the Department of Commerce charged with in terms of its oversight of this program and with the use of proceeds that are allocated under the statute to the Department of Commerce as well? So if we can move to the next slide, please. So if you look at what the purpose is behind the legislation, what we're trying to achieve. And what this body allowed the framework to be constructed to achieve is really to create economic opportunities within rural Kansas communities. Main Street economic development, job and income growth, improved educational facilities, improved healthcare facilities, senior care, community investment, construction and development, items and incentives that the community needs. And here's the important part of this program. It was really modeled after the Rural Opportunity Zone statute and program here in the state of Kansas. And as we were working just as a company on how might this be structured, we noticed that the Department of Commerce had commissioned a study on the ROS program. And one of the findings of that study was, you know, the statewide program is beneficial, but the people who know what the community needs and the people who know how to incentivize opportunity within the community are those community leaders themselves. And they should be empowered to design programs for their specific community. That is what this program is really designed to achieve, to take these assets, place those within the communities that qualify under the statute, empower local leaders to determine what programs need to be funded, to do and commission studies as to the viability of those programs, and then to deploy funds in order to achieve those objectives. So on the next slide, we'll show you the design as it relates to Heston, the city of Heston in Harvey County, which is one of the economic growth zones that has been selected by our company, Beneficient. As Brad mentioned, as each new regulated institution comes into the state to provide these services, they, along with the Department of Commerce, will select other communities that will benefit as well. And so if we start at the kind of upper right-hand corner, Beneficient Fiduciary Financial, that is our trust company located here in the state of Kansas. It is the source of funding for this program through the financing services that we provide to our customers. The 2.5% is allocated to a trust that our company is the trustee of, and the purpose of that trust, as you may recall under the statute, this 2.5% is divided between economic growth zones and the Department of Commerce based on a schedule. And so the charge of this trust is take these assets that come in under the program, allocate them among Commerce and the economic growth zones, and make distributions of the cash associated with that allocation to those parties for use for the programs enumerated in the statute. So the Kansas Department of Commerce receives an allocation. We're going to talk about what they are charged with and that with those proceeds here in a moment. But as to the amounts that are going to communities within the state of Kansas, Beneficient, we have designed really two charitable foundations to receive those proceeds. Those foundations are to be governed by a board of 14 members, the majority of which, in fact, 10 of which would be comprised of local leaders within the community, the mayor, superintendent of schools, the chamber president, the representatives of family-owned businesses, Main Street, retirement center, etc. So community leaders that come together, the president of the local college, that are charged with overseeing these foundations, overseeing the deployment of funds within the various communities. We can move to the next slide. I won't dwell on this just in the interest of time. This will just give you, you can read through it, just a quick summary of the trust structure that I mentioned. The next slide is one of the charitable funds that we have created that would be overseen by this 14-member board. Funds have to be exclusively devoted to economic growth zones and initiatives within those communities. These foundations are required to provide an annual accounting to the Department of Commerce as to what funds did you receive during the course of the year? How did you deploy those funds? What funds do you have remaining? As you can appreciate, the purpose of this program is to infuse that capital within the communities. It is not designed to give a board of 14 members a nice endowment to manage, right, to manage a portfolio. We want those funds in the communities, and so this reporting to the Department of Commerce provides oversight to make sure, are the funds being used the way they are intended to be used, rather than simply amassing in a nice portfolio for folks to manage. It is a public charity, and again, will be governed by a board of 14 individuals, the lion's share of whom are community leaders. The next slide is the second foundation, very similar. Must use funds and commit the use of those funds to economic growth zones or educational, post-secondary educational institutions in the state of Kansas. Provides the annual report to Commerce, focused on funding community-led initiatives, and again, heavy community involvement in terms of the management. Finally, let me just give you a brief overview of Commerce's role. In addition to overseeing the program, in addition to working with other institutions that choose to set up operations in the state of Kansas, helping them partner with economic growth zones, there are financial assets that are allocated to the Department of Commerce. Those are to be added to the TEFI Development and Expansion Fund. And those proceeds are really to be used for two primary purposes. Number one, to provide benefits to communities in these economic growth zones. Can sprinkle those across the state to communities that have a need, that there is a desire to fund those initiatives. And second, as Brad mentioned, also to create a budget so that the Department of Commerce can participate in recruiting other institutions such as Beneficient to set up operations in the state. Because by doing so, not only are we driving additional business into the state, but we're also, through this 2.5% funding mechanism, creating additional assets and resources which can be deployed in these rural Kansas communities. So it is designed to attract business and commerce and to build the banking and trust company industry within the state of Kansas, but equally as important, to provide resources to continue the effort to benefit rural Kansas. And again, oversight that the Commerce Department would have in terms of the proceeds, not only those allocated to commerce, but those allocated to the various foundations that are funding initiatives within these various communities. So with that, kind of concludes my remarks. We can certainly stand for questions now as to this part of the program, or I know Brad would like to kind of wrap up, tell you where we are, because it's going to give you some insight into the magnitude of this economic growth initiative, and then we can certainly answer any questions that you might have.
Why don't I sum up, and then we can do questions?
Sure.
I'll just finish quickly. If we'll move to the next slide, let me give you a little background with where the concept came from. As I said in my remarks, we started with the state of Texas. We worked many years with the Department of the State of Texas. We created all the infrastructure Beneficient with the Department of Banking in the state of Texas. And when it came time to open up to high net worth individuals with all of our infrastructure in place, the Banking Commission said, we don't have a regulatory framework for the next step. We need you to go create the regulatory framework. Our lawyers told us we need to create the regulatory framework. Okay, there's a big difference between Texas and Kansas. Texas meets every other year. So when you introduce a bill, you're going to wait 3 years for it to be heard in committee. When you are in an industry like ours that's new to the state, our state, that state of Texas, has a $130 billion annual expenditure budget. So we don't really catch the eye at all to expedite that 3 to 5 year process. So our attorneys said, well, we need to go to South Dakota because that's the leading banking state in the nation. And we need to go to Utah. Those are the 2 leading banking states in the nation. And so we flew up to Sioux Falls a year ago, first part of December, a few weeks before Christmas. And we met with during COVID, we met with the leading law firm there, and they said, yeah, you'll probably be able to get this done without any statutory amendments, but it's going to take us a year due to COVID. We got so many credit card companies in line wanting to get their charters here. You're just going to have to wait. But I've talked to representatives from the Banking Commission, and we don't think we need any statutory changes. So I'm on my phone with my mother every Saturday morning about 9 a.m., where she and I both have a cup of coffee and we catch up with each other. She lives not far from where she was born, from our family farm there, that we've been farming since the 1880s, and never left the state. And I said, you know, Mom, looks like we're going to have to move the operation to South Dakota. We'll probably have to move about a third of the people up there, 50 people. I said, and no one's going to want to move to Sioux Falls. They even told us the street we were going to need to have a building on. We're going to need to build a building. And I said, Mom, that whole amount that we negotiated with the state of Texas that we would give to Texas, when you do a business like this, you have to give back to your community. And the state of Texas and us negotiated 8 Texas universities, both private and public, that we would donate into the foundations at similar amounts like the economic growth contributions. I said, Mom, those aren't going to go to my alma mater or any of the universities anymore. We're going to have to put them to Sioux Falls universities, and we don't even know anyone up there. We found one cousin that lived up there. And Mom said, well, geez, my mother's in her 80s. She says, Brad, you know, over a year ago, the grocery store closed here in Heston. We used to have 2. We have nothing. She says, it's all icy. I got to hang up. I got to get on the road, and I got to drive down to Newton to Dillon's to get my groceries. It's going to take me an hour and a half. You know, I'm an 80-some-year-old lady. Can't you sprinkle a little bit of that money you're going to give to the universities and get the grocery store renovated, because the operator can't afford to get the new fixtures for it, the new coolers and everything, and it is a rundown old building. And I said, Mom, light bulb went off. And I called my buddy from Heston I grew up with there, Keith, sitting behind me, and we called the mayor, and I flew up on a Sunday, and we sat at Keith's house, and we talked about, well, how do we do what South Dakota did in credit card banking with a statute here in the state where all this money stays here in the state, that we bring this money here from out-of-state investors with out-of-state assets that no bank in this state has and no bank is ever going to have, or trust company. How do we get it here and earn money off of that so we can reopen the grocery store? And that's where it started. The whole plan was, how do we get the grocery store in Heston reopened? Main Street, if you drive down it, most of our Main Street, where we had 2 grocery stores, a flower shop, a bakery, a butcher shop, separate butcher shop. We had Mox's, where you went and bought your sporting goods and your clothes, boarded up, all boarded up in our town. And so that was the genesis behind what we did. Now, in the statutes, we didn't want the state to come out any money. And so you got to create a regulatory framework. That costs money. That costs state employee time and money. So we put into the statute, or we requested to put into the statute, enough funds to launch the Commerce Fund and enough funds to make sure there was plenty of capital available to the Office of the State Banking Commission to do what they needed to do, and enough funds to be able to pay for third parties to come in and advise. And that was when the law passed on July 1st or in mid-April. Those funds were advanced to both the Commerce Department and to the Office of the State Banking Commission, so that state would not come out any money. The law also required us then, as beneficiaries, as part of the pilot, to have to show up front some of these economic growth contributions, this money to go into the economic communities. And so that number was negotiated to be $9 million that would be funded in from beneficiaries off of transactions that we did as part of our pilot program with the state of Texas prior to being required to get statutes done. We had an escrow. And so that amount of money we negotiated to be the first contribution that would go in upon the issuance of our charter under the statute. And then you would have the ongoing amount that need to go into the trust fund for the benefit of communities like my hometown. Finally, we required the regulated entities to be able to make an investment in 5,000 to 10,000 square feet of improvements within those small communities. So you had to make an investment, or you had to invest in a community initiative that was going to lead to some commercial development or retail development to benefit that locality. So I'm going to go through what happened since the law has passed. If we'll go to flip 2 slides. First thing were those what are called qualified investments, that 10,000 square foot and that local presence. We've worked with the city there on 5 or 6 here that you see. We had an empty building on Main Street of 1,000 square feet, another one of 1,800 square feet. The old grocery store was 4,100 square feet. That's not enough for the operator anymore. They need 10,000 square feet. And so what we've been doing for our qualified investments is acquiring a lot of those vacant buildings on Main Street and getting ready to use the next set of funds to reopen them as markets, as grocery stores, and as bakeries and so forth, where the operators do not need to come out of pocket for the real estate, the furnishings and fixtures for the building. They step in and they simply operate the facility. In addition, the city of Heston has a 22-acre abandoned neighborhood that is in need of redevelopment, and so in working with the city on that, that will be part of the mandatory qualified investment as well that we're required to do under the statute. We'll flip to the next piece, though. The next piece is on the economic growth contributions, and we'll show you the sources of the contributions, how much is ready in trust for commerce and how much is ready in trust for economic growth contributions. As I said, $9 million was required to be facilitated at the time in which the charter was issued. The charter, we received we under the law, we interpreted the law that was signed in April to say we would get our charter on December 31. And so we began in the fourth quarter of this year going to the major distributor networks in the 7 different localities around the country to explain to the big private banks and the big distributors, we'll be ready here at the end of this year, first of next year, to open our doors and provide the fiduciary services and the liquidity to your client base. So we began pre-marketing. We didn't even produce very attractive marketing materials. I went around and visited each of those 7 cities 2 times, and we had people come to Dallas as well to explain that we're getting ready to open our doors to build a pipeline of potential customers. We had forecasted on a statutory forecast that 2022, we would expect to bring about $350 to $360 million of assets into Kansas trusts here in Kansas. We forecasted that we would do about $250 million of financings against those assets, now off of our own balance sheet. Now, $360 million of assets in trusts, that puts Beneficient somewhere between the 10th and 12th largest trust division or trust company in the state of Kansas out of 56. So meeting that goal for 2022, our goal was to put us in the range of a top 10 out of 56 trust companies and trust departments of banks in the state of Kansas. That was our goal. Our goal also was to have our own balance sheet. Remember, we don't take deposits, so we're all just assets. There are no liabilities on our balance sheet. But to have our balance sheet amount to in the neighborhood of about $300 million, which would make us the largest balance sheet, permanent balance sheet of all trust companies in the state of Texas. And that, we forecasted, would drive a revenue base that would make us second or first largest in revenues of all trust companies in the state of Texas. That was our forecast for business to do in 2022. Based on the pre-marketing that we did, and on December 30th, when we received the notification from the Alpha State Banking Commission that we would be receiving the charter, we went to work on New Year's Eve, and we worked that weekend, and we worked that first week of January, and we closed in $357 million of assets into trust. We utilized about $250 million of our own balance sheet to deploy across those financings, and we met our 2022 statutory forecast in the first week of January. Now, what that statutory forecast led to was another little more than $6 million that has been deposited in trust for the economic growth zones that we thought would happen this time next year. So we met a lot of demand. We're very excited about it. We were drinking from a fire hose of bringing those customers on board. Most importantly, the legislature and the banking industry wanted to make sure that we weren't simply shifting business from existing trust companies and banks over into our line of business, that we weren't taking from their business. And as Derek and I both explained, we don't do what they do, and they don't have services to do what we do. And so through the distributor networks, we have a little more than 2,500 customers that came in the first week of January. 11, or less than half of 1%, are Kansas residents. Less than $1 million of the $357 million that went into trust are Kansas assets. So we did it. My point on this is we did what was intended to do, and I believe that will continue to be the case because These wealthy individuals and these types of assets are not in Kansas. They're outside. And that was the intent of the legislation. Yesterday, I believe Commerce had a hearing, and you had one of the post auditors in here that gave some discussion on the star bonds. And I believe he commented about the importance of tourists from out of state to come to Kansas because that money is worth more to us than a Kansas resident's money in doing tourism inside the state of Kansas. That's the same in our industry. Bring those assets from people that are not within the state into the state, and that's what the legislation facilitated us to do. So on this last and final chart, the Department of Commerce, in addition to the initial funding in the first half of this year, $250,000, I think, was the initial funding that came in to help to start to hire staff and get the employee needs met. In addition to that, there's $2.7 million that we are holding of cash, I believe, of cash that we are holding in trust, and we'll be working now in the coming weeks with the staff at the Department of Commerce now to facilitate the movement of those funds around to meet the objectives under the statute. In addition, there's another about $12.5 million held in trust for the benefit of the economic growth zones. I think we're going to spend about $4 million of that renovating and reopening the grocery store. The new foundation board has yet to be completely assembled and have its meetings. We've met with all the various candidates for that board, but that's one of the first objectives there on Main Street in Heston. And that's the objective for these types of capital infusions that we would hope to see across the Ross counties as we encourage this other type of commerce to come in and form companies like ourselves here. So that we covered a lot, the industry, our business, some of the statutes, and we would like to answer your questions. I know it's kind of a technical presentation, but wanted to make sure we gave you enough of the details.
Well, that was a lot of information. So I think I got it, but I think I got it enough to be dangerous about it. I'm trying to explain it to someone. Representative Johnson, I think you might have met your match here. So we will open for questions. I have several, but I'll let you guys go first. Representative Highland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for coming. Great presentation. The first question, I have two. You talked about the Heartland Foundation, and you said there were two areas. One was the commit funds to the economic growth zones, and the second I missed. And you said it was a fund to the Department of Commerce for recruiting. Is that correct?
Multiple, but Derek's the expert in this space.
Yes, Representative Highland. So we can, I guess, break it down into kind of three constituents. Okay. So the first is the Department of Commerce with the TEFI Development and Expansion Fund that they oversee. And again, those funds can be used to promote the industry and to benefit economic growth zones. As it relates to the foundation, we have two foundations, and the reason we really did that is one is what is called under the tax law a private foundation, but we also wanted to partner with other charitable organizations within the state of Kansas. So the other foundation is the Central Kansas Community Foundation. And so it is a public charity that is pre-existing, that operates in the state of Kansas, provides charitable services to its donors. And we wanted to partner with a local Kansas charity rather than having all of the assets really in one foundation. So we are working in tandem with them, again, with the idea being we want to partner in the communities in which we have a presence. We would hope that other organizations such as ourselves would do the same. And so we wanted to show that partnership by partnering with an existing charity to work with them in achieving that common objective of benefiting local communities.
Thank you for that. Second question, you mentioned the buildings that you were investing in, and it was Heston, I believe. Who owns those properties?
Who owned them?
Who owns them now?
Oh, well, the foundation will own them. Because we did not have our charter yet. We had to get our charter, and so we began those acquisitions after the law was signed in anticipation of the issuance. So those are owned by Beneficient, by the company, and over the course of the next 4, 5, 6 weeks, they will be transferred into the foundation, and they'll be held, probably the public foundation. Yeah, the public foundation will end up owning those buildings.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Anderson and then Dodson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation. Would you ever need another location in Kansas, or since most everything you do is done electronically, is Heston sufficient?
Most all these companies don't even need a location. You need a location for meeting the compliance requirements with the regulators, where you can keep physical documentation, you can keep the physical networks. Most of our systems, like you said, our business is done online. Our customers are numbers. The people that we deal with are bankers on Wall Street and in LA and in Chicago, who we are actually going through those to the customers online. Our forms are online, closing occurs online, communication and everything occurs online. And so that's one of the points I made when we came to Topeka and explained this, that banking laws are about having buildings, having employee, and supporting that community area with loans and deposits from that area. Our industry is different. We don't need, and COVID really taught us this, we don't need to actually be in buildings with the technology that we operate from. That's one of the purposes that the law is called technology enabled. So no, we wouldn't. The intent, though, is that the foundations, the public and private foundations with these fees go into, they will be funding the economic expansion or the opportunities that the communities have. So the buildings, like these handful that we're doing right now, the foundation is in formation. The minute it's completed, then they just get transferred into those foundations.
Representative Dodson. Oh, I'm sorry, did you want to add to that?
Just to add one comment, that the fact that we operate in Heston, we're certainly not limited in terms of the deployment of those charitable dollars into Heston. So there is the opportunity, and we have discussed and expect that those funds will also be made available to other economic growth zones. So you're not limited to the community in which you operate in terms of the deployment of those charitable dollars.
Thanks, Representative Dodson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Great presentation, appreciate it. When I was looking at this map, when we talk about TEFIs and one being in Kansas, are these blue-green areas meant to represent the only other TEFI areas that we have in the U.S., or what were those meant to represent?
The colored counties on the map are the RAS counties that was in the RAS.
This is the other map, the one that you described about 10 or 11 concentrations of wealth.
That's where the customers are based and where their assets are based. That's a little more than 80% of the businesses in those 7 particular areas.
And do you have to be, like we did in Kansas, do you have to legislate for authorizing a TEFI to participate, or?
No. So in our industry, as long as they form the trust and move their assets here, we're actually working for the Kansas Trust. That's what we're working for. So what the private bank does, the Wall Street Bank, is they advise the customer in that area, Chicago or New York, we advise you to take your asset and establish a Kansas-based trust. Here's the types of terms to that trust, and you transfer that asset into the trust. Now you need to hire a Kansas trustee. And we advise you to hire one of these TEFIs.
And is it his job to attract the funds into the Kansas TEFI?
It's our job to encourage him to attract the funds in to the TEFI. And it's, hopefully the Department of Commerce giving us a regulatory encouragement as well to encourage them to bring them in. Because just like South Dakota was the first with credit card trust banking, led by Citibank going there, and they enacted their laws in 1 week. There's a really fun read from PBS on South Dakota becoming the nation's #1 banking market in the U.S., and it's something like the 7th largest on the globe for a population of 900,000. was done, led by Citibank, encouraging the adoption of statutes that occurred in 1 week there to move credit card trust banking to that state. 20% of it, if we look around this room, about 6 of you are holding credit cards right now that if you made a charge on it right now, it's going through Sioux Falls, South Dakota, through a state bank there, and your fees are going to that population in South Dakota.
Thank you.
And I'll make a comment too in terms of, I don't know if the nature of your question also was our competitors that might be in other jurisdictions. And so those institutions, if they were to provide similar services to our company, the dilemma or the issue they face is one that we faced before this legislation was passed, and that is we had to operate in multiple jurisdictions because no one state had a comprehensive statutory framework that allowed us to consolidate operations in one location. And so as you can appreciate, having multiple operating locations creates great inefficiency in terms of the delivery of your services. It increases the cost. It means you're not as competitive as you'd like to be with what you offer your customers and the pricing. And so we fully expect, and that's one thing we're very excited about, that this isn't a beneficent piece of legislation. This is the industry legislation, and our hope and expectation and our commitment to the Department of Commerce is we want to attract others, and we think it's going to be a very powerful message that you can come to one jurisdiction that has a regulatory framework that can manage all of the delivery of your services, and you don't have to have that parceled out among different jurisdictions. And so that is what we believe will attract not only our customers into the state of Kansas, but others that provide similar services as well. Yes, sir.
I'll just add one more thing to support this further. Of the legislation, 80%, we did a little highlighting of the legislation. 80% of the legislation is plagiarized from 5 states that have sections of that legislation. We just cut and paste from other states and put it together so we had that one jurisdiction as opposed to 5 to operate out of.
So I believe at the time we were told that we would be the first state that actually did this. Are we still the only state, or are there other states that have copied us so far?
No, we're the only state, and I'm not aware of any other states beginning any initiatives right now. We may get lucky because the whole COVID has slowed, state legislatures and so forth down. What we do know is that there are a handful of much larger industry participants in our space who have already engaged law firms to begin figuring out their step into the state, which is great welcome for us.
When does this open for your competitors to come?
The way in which we've been informed by, the way the statute reads and the way in which the Office of State Bank Commissioner is following is they would like to complete a full formal examination of everything that we have been doing and then begin a process of promulgating the rules for examinations and standards and so forth. So if you, in talking to the Deputy Commissioner there this morning, it looks like it will be the end of the second quarter, beginning of the third quarter that they'll initiate the examination of our transactions, and then on the heels of that, begin recommending regulation and promulgating some regulation for the oversight of this.
So in regards to the regulation, you're being regulated by the banking. So you're helping them with the regulations. How's that process going? Is it burdensome or is it relatively easy?
Well, the first step of it was, as Alan said, it was explaining the terms of our industry and matching them to the terms of the industry for trust companies and banking and getting them to line up. And so that has been about the last 4 months. I will tell you what really helped along, and it advanced it quite a long ways, was a 2-day session where they got a waiver to travel during COVID and come to Dallas in early November. We'd been working together for 2 to 3 months, but when they came to Dallas and spent a full 48 hours, we have 140 some employees in Dallas, and they were able to go department to division and meet with our internal audit teams and our systems teams and our legal teams. It advanced it a lot. If we could have, more 48-hour periods, it'll move it along a lot where they can just tangibly see how it operates and how it works.
Was there anything that we left out of the legislation last year that you're going to want a trailer bill type deal to fix? Are there certain issues that are a barrier to entry?
Well, there is one clarification that's already been heard by the Senate Financial Institutions and Insurance Committee this morning, and it'll be worked tomorrow. And it's a technical clarification on the timing of the issuance of the charter to beneficent. There are other early regulatory type aspects that OSBC has put into the House Financial Institutions Committee that we don't believe is the right time, and many of them would be impediments to others coming to the state and impediments to us continuing to operate. So there needs to be more of the educational process in the pilot program among the regulators and us to get to that point of a trailer bill. So my answer to you is one clarification, and then no, for now.
Representative Highland has another question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for the reviser. I can't remember the bill we passed, quite frankly. And we've been talking about the raw zones. So only the raw zones are eligible to participate in this program. Is that correct?
I can add while he looks it up.
Kyle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the bill pulled up in front of me, but I am unfamiliar with the actual legislation. So before answering that, I would want to look through it to make sure I don't miss anything. So I can circle back to you.
Please do.
Until then, I mean, I could defer to the conferee for the moment.
You can answer that?
It's the raw zones. Harvey County was not a raw zone, so it was put in there because of my hometown and where we wanted to operate and start the business. And then colleges and post-secondary educational institutions in the state of Kansas. And there may be, if they find more, but that's what we recall from the bill going through a year ago.
So the counties that chose not to become part of the RAWs, they are excluded from this presently.
Presently, that's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, that's why I would push for Harvey.
Yeah, my apologies. This bill actually went through financial institutions, and so, but it involves the Department of Commerce, so I thought it would be important for us to get an update on it. And it sounds like it's tremendously successful already, and we're looking forward to a lot more. Let me see what other, I had some of the things written down. Your assets, so we're
equity.
Obviously you had to have a lump sum of money somewhere. Is this just
right?
You've compiled it over time, and that how many assets did you move to the state of Kansas?
We have in the state of Kansas in trust $360 million in trust. We have off our balance sheet $260 million that we moved off our balance sheet. Our balance sheet is made up of principally equity, and our holding company is principally all equity, and about less than a third of the balance sheet is borrowings, but that's borrowings from the founders of the company. So it's in friendly hands. So overall, you have about 40 owners in the company, and then the management and professionals of the company, we have probably around 90 executives in the company that own about 15% of the company. Members of the board also own a substantial amount of the company as well. It's privately held.
Okay, so you mentioned that this market is $40 billion strong right now. How much of that would you, like if everybody decided they wanted to do this, like you said, how much would you be able to do this year? What's your capacity?
We have, well, on the capacity, we have a variety of different products that we can offer customers. And so on the capacity side, you're going down a path where I'll be spending a good deal of my time the rest of the year, because we planned about $260 million of transactions in our business. We would like to see ourselves at the $4 billion a year mark, or $300 million a month. Now, it's going to scare everybody, but that is where we would like to see ourselves from a business standpoint. From the statutory standpoint, we have a lower forecast overall. So I spend a good deal of my time with my shareholders and other shareholders in raising equity capital. I spend a good time going around and doing that. And that's important to continue to fuel the balance sheet here to do this business.
Okay, seeing no further questions from the committee, well, really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming in and informing us. I feel like most of us kind of understand the program that we voted on last year now. So thanks so much, and keep it up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With that, we'll adjourn for today, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.